Welcome back to the Integral Stage sub-series called the Meta Podcast, where we podcast podcasters, broadcast broadcasters, and generally reflect on people who are facilitating higher, deeper, and transformative perspectives through online media. I'm Layman Pascal, and today I'm sitting down on the old Athenian porch with Peter Limberg to talk about the Stoa, about himself, about emerging wisdom discussions, the Ontario Renaissance, if that exists, and what the hell the world needs right now. Ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between, it's Peter Limberg. Hi, Peter.
That's quite an introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, my friend.
All right. Now, I think people who watch this know me as a curmudgeon about introductions, so let's just jump into difficult things.
All right. I'm nervous already. All right. Be gentle.
I'll try to give a lot of context on this, and then you'll have something to work with. The Stoa. I know that the online manifesto says that you could have called it anything else, but the name evokes the philosophical wisdom schools of ancient Athens prior to modern notions of academia. And for those guys, higher, deeper education consisted of like walking around with a wise person and arguing with their peers. Our fellow Canadian Marshall McLuhan sketched out the transformations of culture beyond literacy into the digital environment. And I'm wondering what your sense is of the educational situation as we move beyond literacy, so to speak. Do we need to revive the peripatetic conversational pseudo-guru style of education they used in ancient Athens? What's your own feeling about your academic background, and what's your sense of what would be a useful higher education going forward?
Mm-hmm. So all those questions are way above my pay grade. And we were joking, like my question avoidance game is really good. So we'll see how good. But yeah, I will take a crack at this question. And I like to kind of ground things into my personal experience,
Sure.
Before jumping into kind of these more abstract notions of understanding. Yeah, it's just, it feels like the academy failed me in a way when I went to university. I went to University of Toronto, where, Jordan Peterson was there, and then John Vervaeke was there. And I wasn't John's student, but I was a sort of meditation student, oddly enough, when I was at the university. Never actually took one of his classes, though. And then John are colleagues, as you might know, in kind of our cowboy research project and all this interesting we-space, circling space type psychotech. But yeah, I felt like the academy just failed me. It had a lot of good stuff, but it didn't feel like that where the spirit of truth was flowing, at least for me. And then I took philosophy, so it didn't feel like it was flowing through the philosophy department. And we just came from a session at the Stoa about Stoicism. We hardly talk about Stoicism at the Stoa, so this was like a rare occurrence. And Matthew Sharp was the guy who was there, and he had the same thing, that he didn't learn about Stoicism at all during his academic experience. And I didn't either. And it was only outside of the academy where we learned about it. And it was such a practical, like gripping philosophy for me. It was like coming home. And all the best kind of deep conversation, like I discovered Ken Wilber's work, outside of academia, that really just sort of like ameliorated some of the postmodern induced anxiety that I experienced, like in the kind of the walls of the academy. And so all of the most delicious, cutting edge conversations I had didn't happen in the classroom. It happened outside of it. And it was great. And so this thing, the Stoa and the stuff that I was doing before, it was kind of like recreating that. Like almost like, when you're this starry-eyed first year university student, and you're just like, oh my God, like you're at your edge of your thinking all the time. I wanted to be there again. And so I created these spaces where, I could be there and could help other people be there and kind of make it cool and sexy at the same time.
That's beautiful. I have a lot of those same feelings. I wrote an essay that got me a scholarship into the university, and it was about what I thought university was going to be. And when I got there, it was not that. They were not really trying to elevate me intellectually or culturally at all. And so I had to look for those things in other places, to the point where I started to wonder if those other places were the future of education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there's a phrase on the Stoa landing page. It says the Stoas stewarded demonic fire on an obscure hill in the noosphere.
I'm going to edit that before people can.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful phrase. Whoever wrote that is a genius. But it also says there's something about this is not a place people come for a reason, because they're coming for something that's beyond a reason. And I'm curious about how you take that. Like, when you think of beyond a reason, what are you thinking of? Is it just the absence of knowledge? Is it an active ontological force of mystery in the cosmos? Is it a human subconscious intelligence that has a hard time conveying itself as conscious verbal rational information? When you think beyond reason as a motivating force, what are you thinking of?
Mm-hmm. So first, I write a bunch of poetic nonsense all the time. I wouldn't hold myself to whatever I said in the past. Don't have that like broad caveat. Yeah. But I think when I was gesturing towards there is, so if anyone follows my journals, so I do this journal practice, which Marcus Aurelius did. It's like a Stoic practice to journal to oneself. And then when COVID came online, I'm like, hey, might as well journal to myself publicly, because that's kind of a cool thing. And then I'm stewarding this place called the Stoa. So I thought it was all kind of neat. And so if you read those journals, I talk about something, what I call the daimon or the daimon. Socrates famously had a daimon. And the Stoics view eudaimonia, like being in right relationship with the daimon, and to be virtuous, and you get to be have eudaimonia. And so the way I hold it is like, I view myself as a man of reason. My reasoning game is pretty tight. No slouch in that department. But if I'm really like honest with myself, there's a limit. It's like, I think being good at reasoning puts reasoning in its place, and you got to start listening to something else. And there's probably many different traditions that have more sophisticated kind of languaging towards what I'm referring to as this daimonic thing. But that's the thing that pretty much I've been following since day one of the Stoa project, and basically all my creative projects. Like, there's no real kind of like guarantee with them. It's like hard to kind of justify them through some utilitarian lens, but it just feels beautiful and artistically right. And I learning how to trust that.
Do you think, like, here's an interesting question from the point of view of developmental theory, right? Like, when you deal with Ken Wilber stuff, and he thinks about your basic cognitive line of intelligence is leading everything else, because you can't have an ethical or artistic relationship with something if you don't recognize it as existing. So we have this basic capacity to recognize patterns, but that's very easy to conflate that with the conscious intellect. And when in reality, a lot of our capacity to relate with patterns is subconscious and mysterious and heuristic and things like that. So I'm always curious about whether, how we think about our subconscious as developing through stages. And a lot of our ancestors, when they thought about things like the daimon, they thought about it as a kind of all-knowing, already existing perfection that we struggle to be in relationship with. Do you see it as that, or do you see it as growing, developing, and changing?
I don't know. I'm curious. I feel like I have way more to learn about this from you, you from me, to be honest. So I'm curious if you could elaborate your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess it's obvious in the way I asked the question that I do think of another part of myself as having an entity like semi-independent intelligence, and I think of that part as the fundamentally growing, developing part of myself. But I guess I would say that I think it grows by a certain kind of merger between what I think of as conscious and unconscious experience, right? Like, I don't think my gut doesn't just know everything. My gut has to get up to speed on things. Superficially, I can take in statistical information about the world that my gut was not evolved to know. On the other hand, my gut's much better at doing things than my conscious surface intelligence. And if I can get them together, I feel like I can grow my gut up through stages, because that's my personal goal. Is I would like it to be smarter than me. I would like to be able to really trust it, but that means I have to trust it not just to inherit archaic wisdom. I have to trust it to be able to assimilate and act on contemporary knowledge as well.
Right. And I'm curious how that is showing up in your life, specifically in this domain of like intellectual dialogue and these emerging conversations. And you're kind of like at the cutting edge of the kind of the integral scene. You're coming to the Stoa, doing the kind of history on it, and all the adjacent spaces. And some of this stuff gets really galaxy brain and abstract, and a lot of people can't relate to it. So how do you kind of maintain that balance between listening to that sort of energy that you described, and then with taking in all this sort of sometimes abstracted information from the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, part of it is just how you balance your day, I think, right? Like I can sit down and have a bunch of really high level intellectual conversations about the meta level mapping of the world, but I also have to go for a walk and fix the shed and cook a meal. And right, as long as I keep thinking that those are just as important, then I kind of balance those things out. So that's my first level of defense is just to mix it with other things. Second is I really don't trust anything until it's been regenerated out of me in some unique fashion, right? So it's great. I'm reading metamodernism. I'm in the game bee community. I'm studying Ken Wilber. That's all terrific. But it's only when I have an idea and I go, oh, I think I see how that works. And I got to diagram it. I got to write it down. It comes out of myself somehow. And it's a little bit like what everybody's saying, but it's also distinct in some way. And then I feel like I locked something down. And then it's not just an abstract conversation space that is happening socially. Then it's something really about me that I'm emotionally invested in.
Yeah, I like that. And sort of, I'm doing this thing with Rebel Wisdom called Becoming a Live Player, and we're leaning on Daniel Schmachtenberger's tripartite epistemics. Well, it's not his, but he was kind of talking about it. And you obviously know this, but like just to kind of say for people who might not, like the first person epistemics is sort of like that intrasubjective awareness, that embodiment. Second person is that intersubjective, like really understanding someone else's worldview, and then the third person is like kind of objective, like logical reasoning, all that type of stuff, scientific literacy. And it's kind of like the project of getting all those three epistemics into right relationship with one another. That's the thing that sort of feels like my journey. And the Stoics, they say, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. And before you can embody your philosophy, you have to have the capacity to be embodied. And that's like the first person epistemics. And that's when people say you get tapped into the inherent intelligent and all that type of stuff. So I really like that modeling because it kind of helps. And then kind of having a sensitivity of the ecology of practices that surround that sort of epistemics. And then how are they in relationship with everything else, and trying to get that kind of thing working really. So that's sort of been, I wouldn't call it a conscious project, but a project that I'm daimonically stumbling upon.
Yeah, I think, efforts like the integral community efforts, which are sort of what are the minimum set of things we need to integrate? They're really good. And one of the things they have is these different epistemological lenses that we need to integrate. But another part of it, relating back to the previous question and your use of the word intra-psychic or intra-subjective, right? A lot of my thinking, especially in my conversations with Vervaeke, is around the notion that religion and spirituality is somehow a hybrid fusion of subjective subsystems. And you were asking like how I personalize something that could be really generic and abstract. And a lot of that is an intentional spiritual work of bringing different lines of intelligence to bear and trying to blend them so that emotional, physiological, and mental phenomenon, I track them together and I try to intentionally blend them. Right? I have a kind of background in the Gurdjieff work, so to speak, but I think generally speaking, we have multiple different intelligent subsystems to some degree. And if we can cause them to harmonize, interpenetrate, resonate with each other more densely, then we have a more, not only a more authentic way of relating to something, but we also get this bonus payoff, which is like a generalized experience of beingness.
So again, I have a desire to be your student right now. Like, how? Teach me, Layman. And like, yeah, we're really like how does that look in everyday life? Like, what's the praxis of that for you?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different ways to go at it. I mean, there's a basic set of sub skills that you need, right? And so one of them is just being aware of yourself as a multiplicity and tracking what the major elements of that subjective plurality are, what they're like, how they show up, things like that. Another element is being willing to have them in conflict, to occupy the space of cognitive dissonance so that it might become cognitive resonance. And another element of it is like the ability to think and feel intentionally, let's say, right? Like if I come across something, if I have a new perception, I go, oh, that's a really interesting idea, or I've never seen a duck doing that before. Then I go, okay, what other systems could be involved? What's the same as that experience in terms of my emotions? And I don't know what that is. I have to try it out, try many things until I find an emotion or a physiological or somatic response that corresponds to that, where I have I don't know if you're familiar with Genlin's work on the felt shift,
Right,
yeah. Practice, but it's a little bit like that. You're looking for something where you feel it click in. You're like, oh, now I have an idea and I have an emotion or I have a physiological response and they click in together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, so heart, mind, and body are the ancient, simple way to do it. But in the Howard Gardner sense, you could throw in kinesthetic, aesthetic, whatever other intelligence you want. But I think you take in perceptions that are interesting and novel to you, and you find how they connect to other subjective subsystems in a way that feels like it links. So that's the active mode. And then the passive mode of the same thing is like when you're just sitting in your meditative situation. You think, for example, a very simplified way is, are my heart, mind, and body, are my three major systems, are they all present? What are they doing right now? Are they balanced? Right. And I can just sort of toggle between them until they kind of balance. And when they balance, an additional overtone emerges.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's what I was going to ask, is sort of the container of that, because you're doing it in the wild when you're going for a walk or whatever. But it seems like meditation is the thing where you practice.
Yeah. And there's very different approaches to meditation. I used to teach it, and looking at it phenomenologically and neurologically, I would say there's 3 or 4 major subtypes, right? You can be concentrating, you can do some kind of open mindfulness, allowing everything to arise. You can be doing something like the transcendental meditation people, where you're constantly releasing into a subtler and subtler attractive phenomenon. Or you can be doing something that's uniting different neurological systems together into a higher resonance. And so I try to do all of those each day, but it's definitely the latter category that over time has become the one that feels the most reliable, the one that has outdistanced my best peak experiences, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've decided to ask more questions, but I'm going to pause myself right here. I don't want to take over your podcast. This is what I do too. So I avoid questions.
As long as we both keep talking, I'm sure everyone's happy.
Okay, good. I do 2 things usually. I avoid questions, then I take over podcasts. And this is what you get when you invite the steward.
Okay, you and I have some things in common. One thing we have in common is that we play some role in meta discourse sense making webs. And like, if a guy sits down to talk to me, there's a good chance he was just on the Stoa and he's about to be on Jim Rutt's podcast.
Right.
The other thing we have in common is this Ontario thing. Now, I didn't grow up here. I moved out here a couple of years ago from BC, but my father and my father's father are Torontonians.
I didn't know you're from Ontario. You're
Yeah, I'm in Thunder Bay right now.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
So there's an interesting thing, it seems like, going on in this area, like a lot of, in terms of physics and philosophy and big picture thinking, but also traditionally in comedy as well. There's a real dynamism to this part of the world. Like, I want to say like Wayne and Schuster, Marshall McLuhan, Kids in the Hall, Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, Tom Green, Kurt Jaimungal, us, like, what is your take on the cultural ethos of Ontario? And do you think the penchant for comedy and the penchant for big picture physics and philosophy in this area of the world have anything in common?
And so you think Ontario is kind of like a hub for comedy too?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Dan Aykroyd, Wayne and Schuster, Jim Carrey, Kids in the Hall. Like, there's a long tradition of pretty subversive, intellectually sophisticated, ironic comedians coming out of this part of the world.
Right. Yeah. And I know for the intellectual portion, it has a buzz in this sort of whatever space you want to call it, sense making, web meta modern, game be integral, that like, oh, Toronto's where it's happening. Oh my goodness. Like, there's John Vervaeke here, Peterson's doing something. You got these crazy Stoics. But it just feels like it's in that ecology that it has this buzz that Toronto's like the place that's happening. I don't think people outside of Toronto think that, oh, this is an intellectual capital of the world right now. So I just like what's like kind of like be a little modest right there. But does seem like there is something where these like kind of weird autodidactic thinkers that, like, even if they're operating in the institutions like John is, they're really independent thinkers. And so I don't know what that is, to be honest, but I witnessed something is here. So I'm it sounds like you have some thoughts in that regard.
Well, I never thought about it too much, but I've moved here recently, so I'm getting the lay of the land. And whenever I don't know if you know Alexander Bard, Syntheism, Intellectual Deep Web, but every time I talk to him, he's super psyched about Ontario. It's his first destination as soon as planes are flying again from Sweden.
Well, actually,
he's sort of put it in my mind to try to ask myself whether there is something happening here or not.
I think it's like I'm kind of hyping up Toronto too. Like, yeah, Toronto's where it's at, but I don't know how much of it is a hyper reality. But I actually created the Intellectual Deep Web forum with Bard when I first started. And he was actually going to come to Toronto and visit us and John Vervaeke, but then COVID happened, so that didn't happen. So perhaps it's just me planting seeds in Bard's head that like Toronto's where it's at. But that's how things happen, like hyperstition. You just kind of like say this is where it's at, and then it becomes where it's at.
Well, I guess we're doing that right now then. Let us continue to create the illusion that Toronto is the new intellectual center of the universe.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe Bard will come and we'll all get together.
Mm-hmm. There is, but yeah, there's, we have like the largest Stoic community in Toronto before, COVID happened, the in-person group that is. There's Monastic Academy. There's one that's in between Toronto and Kingston. I don't know if you had Yasna on your thing, but that'd be definitely a good connection. Lubomir Arzov, the guy who did In Shadow. Actually, John, Lubomir, Yasna, myself, and then Daniel was Stoic. We had a in-person bi-weekly circling group in Toronto that we met. So it was like a sense-making super all-star team that we're circling every second week. So yeah, just seems like all these fucking cool people here. So I don't know what it is, but there's something. So let's create the myth. I'm down for that.
I'm in. Well, let's talk about a couple of those guys because lots of people are interested in them. Let's do Vervaeke. I love him. Always have a great time talking with him. He's right on the edge of the wave. He's a hella good gesticulator. What's your overall impression of John, and why do you think he caught fire in the last couple of years? And what functional place do you think he holds in the sense-making web?
Well, I love John. I think he's a genius. And I also think he's a beautiful human being. So that's my assessment on John. I first met him when I was doing like meditation classes at the University of Toronto. And him, Jordan Peterson, and another guy were sort of the life-changing psychologists at U of T. This is before Peterson became kind of famous. And yeah, Peterson went off, and then John kind kind of this waking from the meaning crisis thing. And just before he did that, I had a podcast and invited him on, introduced him to circling and the guy saying stock. And that's kind of got him on the sense making web scene. And then he went on the emerge and rebel wisdom and stuff like that. So I kind of nudged him in this partially in this world. And yeah, I don't know what it is. It's that he has such coherency in his thought. There is probably an issue of accessibility, though, because a lot of terminology and kind of intellectual jargon that some people look at his stuff and it appeals to a certain mind too. But there's such coherency in his argument of what the meaning crisis is, which I think resonates with people, at least in this sort of wider space. And I do think he's at the cutting edge of where we need to be with the Dialogos project. I think that is it. I think that's the response to not only the meaning crisis, but the meta crisis and the thing I write about, the culture war 2.0. So yeah, I'm highly supportive of John. Him and I, before COVID, we were going on this like cowboy research project where we're doing like circling, empathy circles, insight dialogue. We're engaging in all these different intersubjective practices to kind of support this Dialogos project. So I kind of went off my own thing with the Stoa, but yeah, John and I are really tight still.
John and Jordan Peterson have some differences, but in terms of what Jordan Peterson is doing, he's clearly embodying a Dialogos practice. So what's your take on Jordan? I think I read that you did therapy with him. Is that true?
Yeah.
And what's your take on him as a person? Because obviously he's a very energizing, polarizing influence. I just spoke to my father and brother as part of a family Mother's Day Zoom thing yesterday, and they're both starting the self-authoring course. Right. There's something very, I think, attractive about him to the rural, the conservative, the Canadian, the disenfranchised, the masculine. Yeah, he's obviously a fascinating figure to the world. How do you feel about Jordan?
Yeah, well, I have a love for him as well. He was my therapist for 2 years before he became culture war famous. And the last session I had with him, it just worked out like this. It was the day that he released those videos that kind of put him in the culture war. And a lot of our conversations were about the stuff that he was talking about publicly. And he was very reticent to talk about it. He was very reticent, and he wasn't the kind of the culture war energy figure. It's sort of like that side of him came out when I was there, and like all the kind of the key moments when he first went outside of his Sydney Smith at the University of Toronto, and all these like social justice warriors were yelling at him and stuff like that. And that moment there was a big moment for him. I could tell, because he's like, oh shit, I'm confronted with this energy. That was the first time he was actually confronted with it in person. And then he just went on this like crazy fame algorithm. And it was weird because before I started seeing him as a client, I was talking to a buddy of mine, David Gosley. I don't know if you know him, but he's one of John's colleagues as well. I'm like, how come this guy's not more famous? That's what I said before I saw him as his client, because he had like such a star quality, but he only was like on local television, and like he wasn't like, it's kind of like knowing a local indie band if you're like into the intellectual scene back then, right? And I'm like, how come this guy's not more famous? And I remember like just seeing Peterson rise, and I said to David, like, how come he's this famous? It's just like, it doesn't compute to me, like kind of like either direction. And I don't think he even can make sense of it, but he just caught a wave. And I think he was the first guy that, and just a lot of our conversations were about, because I was working at the University of Toronto at the time when I was his client, and he was working at the University of Toronto, and I was at the University of Toronto. Think about this, right? So Canada, Toronto, University of Toronto, and I was also working in the Division of Human Resources as a project analyst. So I was like, you don't get more woke than that, right? Like the kind of like that energy was just permeating. And yeah, and at that time, I think it was 2014 to 15 when we were talking, is like there was a great fear of just saying things that were against it. And then Donald Trump came on the scene, and it really had this weird existential opening where he was just like, kind of like this crazy bullshit, like apex narcissist type character, but he was just saying things, and they're like, oh shit, you can say that. And that had an opening. I think that encouraged people to kind of like speak their truth in a nuanced way. But then they got pattern matched into kind of like different, like, culture war warring tribes and whatnot. But yeah, there's a certain energy in the air at the time. You couldn't say anything. And then he came along and he said something very like coherent, forthright, and he stood his ground. And then no one saw that at the time. And then, you know, all of this kind of like the anti-woke industry arose from it. But he was like the first person who did it well and with kind of like the spirit of authenticity. And I think that is a part of his rise to fame. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to lump Peterson and Trump into the same category, but like you say, there's a moment at which something like that is catching fire. And one of the qualities of that is it's very engaging because it's very polarizing in some respects, right? And there's a lot of people in the communities that we're involved in would look at Jordan and say, you know, why isn't he a little more balanced? Why isn't he a little more like this? But at the same time, it would not be nearly as engaging if it wasn't as polarizing, right? Do you think that a more balanced, let's say integral perspective can be as engaging as somebody who puts off as many people as they turn on?
You know, I actually introduced Peterson to Ken Wilber's work. Like, I remember I printed out the AQUIL model, like AQUIL, and then I kind of showed it to him. And I don't think he vibed with it. He just, okay, he just kind of dismissed it. But he wasn't aware of Ken's work, and I don't think he is now. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't know. I'm optimistic, you know, but there's this total biased because I'm just hanging around with fucking awesome people like yourself that kind of get it. And I do see more people like having this kind of outrage porn fatigue.
Yeah.
And then they're finding their way to places like Rebel Wisdom, the Stoa, your channel, John's work. And it might be a slow way to go about it, you know, to steal the culture in this way. But I'm just optimistic. I'm wildly optimistic. And I don't feel called to play that outrage porn game, even though there's like an awareness that if you just be some kind of troll on the internet, you're going to get like a bunch of likes. And I see these people like, I don't know, like Jake Paul. I'm like, what the fuck are these people even doing? And they're like millions and millions of followers. And here I'm like pumping out gold every day, or at least in my mind. And so I was like, but like I have no, and you know, there's awareness that I can play this kind of like the social media game, quote unquote, better in order to get the metrics. But then there's cost to that, because then you're just going to get a download of egoic noise coming your way, and then you'll get corrupted by it if you're not in the right relationship with it. So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts on that.
I'd like to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Wendy's, Ken Wilber's new line of edible undies. Yes, these high-quality turquoise-colored psilocybin microdose infused and definitely stylish undergarments come in a variety of styles and are great for any occasion, from the pre-trans jockeys to the crotchless four-quadrant panties. You know, folks, I don't usually wear or eat underwear, but I've got to tell you, in all honesty, this project has really made a difference in my life. I'm wearing a pair of cinnamon-flavored boxer briefs right now, inscribed with developmental stages along multiple lines of intelligence, as researched by top theorists in the field. And I'm not embarrassed to tell you, I took a big bite out of them earlier. So if you love the marriage and sense and soul, you'll love the marriage of flavor and comfort that comes in every delicious post-pluralistic pair of Wendy's. And right now you can sign up for a special monthly delivery service. Just go to www.wonderfulwendy's // bonus and get 25% off immediately with the promo code TIS. That's TIS !
What about you?
Well, yeah, I'm torn because, you know, I'm talking to all these people and we're trying to put out this content, and there's a question of how important it is to try to reach broader audiences. And if you want to reach broader audiences, should you tailor yourself to the dynamics that broader audiences seem to go for? And yet there's something in us, I think, that makes that a difficult choice to make. Like if I were to say to myself, all right, I'm going to stop being so reasonable and balanced and inclusive, I'm going to start saying stuff that upsets as many people as it excites. I don't know if I'm even capable of that. You know, I can play a little bit outside the lines. I can be robust and anti-fragile and humorous. And, you know, Bruce and I can do this channel in a slightly more playful way than some of the other channels. But I really don't know, like, how I relate to the risk of upsetting people, and how that risk relates to my understanding intellectually and ethically of how you're supposed to relate to human beings and frame your picture of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like one thing, maybe I'll just, a bunch of thoughts are coming up, so I'll just sort of like toss them in a fragmented way and see if we can weave them together. But going back to that tripartite epistemics, it's like the way I view culture war, what I call culture war 2.0, and like I don't view the culture war as like a left and right affair as you imagine. It's like a multipolar war with all these what I call nomadic tribes, just like battling for the real estate of our minds. And I view culture war 2.0 through that lens of the tripartite epistemics, is that everyone is so fucking cocksure of their third person epistemics, the objective truth. They suck. There's no skill at second person epistemics. And there's like a poverty in their first person epistemics. So they're just disembodied. They're not connected. Right. So they're just kind of like, dunking on other people and, barfing out memes on the internet, but they're not really kind of like, connected in right relationship, all those three things. And, I'm coming to a place where there's like a deep aporia. Like I think I know some things, but I hold to a lot of things lightly. And I'm quite ignorant. And I'm kind of know my lane, my circle of competence. But I'm really fucking good for some reason with the second person epistemics. And I'm getting better with the first person, kind of being more embodied, listening to the daimon and all that type of stuff. And so the project with the Stoa is sort of like this idea of transmuting the culture war to a culture dance. And so instead of like kind of selling my third person epistemics, like, hey guys, this is what we got over here. We got integral theory, meta modern game B, like cool, right? But that's not my project. My project is to kind of like have more capacity in the other two epistemics, especially the second person epistemics, and kind of like teach it in a way or get other people to learn it. Because that's how we seduce the culture, having that capacity to like really fucking listen in the wild. So that's why I don't like on the Stoa, on the YouTube page, I say Stoa is not a fucking YouTube channel. I have an anti-marketing strategy. I don't do any tags. I hide the comments. People hate me because of it, right? But I don't care. It's like it's a beacon though, just to get an idea to actually come into space and then practice these things, because we have a wisdom gym like collective presencing, circling, glass beak game, all these types of things. So that's one thing I'm really interested in, is like getting all these really smart people to get skilled in this area and then go out in sort of the wild. And I could talk about kind of like what's coming up. I just want to pause and see what's alive for you. But like talking about kind of like the 3 steps of how I see the Stoa, like the Stoa's game plan in this, the culture. But I just want to pause because I said a bunch of stuff.
Well, let's make sure we get back to that. But, when I talk to people, I come from a very spiritual practice background. And so the somatic subtle energy thing is very prominent in my experience. And so in all these interviews we're doing, like what we've set up the integral stage to do is to try to be more playful and out of the box than some of these, and to try to be high and low, right? We don't just want to talk to people who are published integral author lecturers. We also want to talk to whoever's starting a Spiral Dynamics TikTok page. Like we want to kind of cover the terrain. And then I'm there as the point person. And my experience is this feeling that I want to blend everybody in myself, almost physically, right? Because I feel like there's an emergent quality that nobody can quite discern intersubjectively, that isn't fully encapsulated by the objective picture or the general types of categorization and meta patterning that we can all make, although that's important. There's the more important thing is that the community of people like this, whatever that consists of, is the future of the well-being of the world, as far as I can tell. And I want to saturate myself with that as much as possible as my participation.
Yeah, I like that. It's really well put, and how that tracks to what I'm doing with the Stoa. So, and this kind of relates to the second person epistemics thing. And it's like I view it kind of like 2 movements there. So it's on one hand, you want to have the capacity to have like a theory of mind where you can kind of what they call pass the ideological Turing test. So it's like if you're talking to a conservative and you're a liberal, then you can trick that conservative to thinking you're a conservative, right? So if you have that capacity, at least, right, then you can play in that propositional realm. But you also want to be able to like feel what they feel when they believe what they believe to be true. And that's that first person epistemic that's falling into that. And like I have an acting background, and so it's like that's kind of easy to me to like method act someone else's worldview, not only just kind of regurgitate their propositions. And so that's something that's really cool to get practice in. And I'm sort of viewing the Stoa as a practice space for that for me, and being able to vibe with all these radically different worldviews. And I would say that perhaps the Stoa is one of the most mimetically diverse places on the internet right now, because we had like Noam Chomsky, ContraPoints on, Alexander fucking Dugin came on. We have like John Zerzan, who's like the Unabomber's confidant at one point, right? So we have like wild, and then we have all the metamodern, Game B, you know, even post rats. So in each person that comes on, they have a different vibe about them. Obviously, their propositions or worldview are different, but there's a certain temperament about them too. And just kind of like sinking into both of those and vibing, like you said, just kind of integrating it within myself. Because it's like, I love the elephant and the blind man and the elephant metaphor. And it's like similar to like Ken Wilber's quotes, like no one's smart enough to be 100% wrong. Like someone has their hand on an elephant, a certain part of the elephant, and they're totalizing all of reality to that part of the elephant. So that's wrong. We can propositionally say that's not true, but just honoring that hand, because there's a fucking intimacy there that no one else knows about except that hand. Whether it's even like QAnoners or incels or like, you know, Antifa, they got a hand on the place. And it's like honoring that and engaging in like, as best as one can, dialogos with it. And I think more in, I'm going to go on a rant, so I'm just going to pause myself, but it's like, I'm curious what's it like for you?
Well, there's something been lurking in the back of my mind for this talk. And I'm, you know, because obviously the word Stoa itself predisposes me towards thinking of classical philosophers. So I'm curious who you like in terms of classical philosophers, or maybe the more general question behind that is, who are your intellectual heroes?
Yeah. It's such a bait and switch, the Stoa, right? Because it's like people on the surface, like kind of the more normies that are not aware of it, they just think Stoicism. Like we had David Allen, the Getting Things Done guy. Like I love David Allen, and he just talks about Stoicism to me. Oh, Stoicism! Oh my god! But like literally, man, we had like 98% of our people are not Stoics or not about Stoicism. So there's nothing about Stoicism at the Stoa, even though I'm sort of like maybe a Stoic. And I find that delicious because there's like a bait and switch thing there. And I have like some jazzy thoughts around that. And then where the Stoa came upon its 1 year anniversary, and we converted 0 people to Stoicism. And that's like, I'm really proud of that. It's like I've converted 0 in my 1 year of being a Stoic stewarding a place called the Stoa. Because it's like Epictetus, right? Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. And I'm playing the long game here. So yeah, and just that's just how it came alive. And to answer your question, my intellectual heroes. So obviously the Stoics. Like I'm not gonna lie, like they saved my life on multiple occasions. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. You know, the OG Socrates. You gotta give your respect to Socrates. And then I have an existentialist strand. You know, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre. They were influences on me. And I have a self-help strand. I'm a trainer in Dale Carnegie, hence the kind of second person epistemics and sort of like that Napoleon Hill New Thought movement. That was informative. And I think right now it's, I think the metamodern, Game B, and of course, Ken Wilber integral theory was a huge influence on me. So that's sort of like an intellectual landscape of my influence. But I'm just have so much intellectual curiosity that I vie with lots of different worldviews.
Well, let me give you a question that I wrestle with myself, which is, as a huge fan of Socrates, and I did my own translation of the Symposium, and as a huge lifelong delver into Nietzsche, how do you personally adjudicate the tension there? Like Nietzsche's critiques of Socrates, I love them, but somehow for me they don't in any way diminish or actually critique what I consider Socrates to be.
Yeah. And like, I haven't read all of Nietzsche, but it seemed like he respected him at the same time, though. You know, like he gave his respect to Socrates, and it's kind of like, in same thing. Oh, he didn't really, he hated the Stoics. He dunked on them hard. But like, you know, he, like when you kind of criticize Socrates, it seemed like to me it came from a source of respect too. And yeah, like I don't like, I wouldn't call myself a Socrates follower or Nietzsche follower. I could just kind of accept what I like about them. But I'm curious how that tension shows up in your life and how you resolve it.
Well, it's interesting. I guess one of the ways I resolve it, I mean, I have a very idiosyncratic take on Nietzsche. One of the ways I handle that is I modify my interpretations as I go. So I might think of Socrates, when Nietzsche critiques Socrates, and he says this is a guy who was sort of standing at a place where the great instinctive philosophical spiritual tradition of ancient Greece suddenly went downhill into a superficial rationalism. And what we need is a musical Socrates who touches the unconscious depths again. In my mind, I'm like, oh, that is what Socrates was. So I take Nietzsche's critique and I just retroactively apply it like a Hegelian would back onto Socrates and say that's the essence of what he actually was. But I have a lot of, like I was saying, I have a spiritual background. So for me, Socrates is closer to an Eastern guru than he is to Western intellectual philosophical type of character, right? Like I see him as an embodied wisdom radiance figure whose primary interest was to get other people involved in an intense intersubjective transmission experience, and that he used the clarification of concepts as a means to do that. So I don't see Socrates as the arch figure of rational investigation that Nietzsche was attacking.
Yeah, I vibe with that. And it's just seems wildly uncharitable too, because the guy, you know, he didn't write anything himself. You know, it was based off Plato's work, and then whoever the other guy that wrote about him in that comedy. And yeah, it's just the legacy of the Socratic method itself. It's so beautiful. It's not like you're arriving someplace in some kind of rational destination. It's the journey. And to me, philosophy and art is like the lines become blurred quite quickly when you do philosophy right.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's weakness is in relationship. He saw forward in many respects better than anybody else, right? He was charting the postmodern 200 years ago. It was ridiculous how good he was on that. But when it comes to men and women, when it comes to friendships, when it comes to mutuality, he didn't really get a lot of breaks in that respect. And so he didn't have a lot of experiential wisdom there. So I think he's, the interpersonal discursive dialogos method is not Nietzsche's specialty, but it was Socrates' specialty. And I think Socrates had an incredible method of, hey, let's dig into the essence of whatever anybody's talking about as a pretext for getting some kind of depth vibe going that makes life worth living.
Mm-hmm. And what's coming to mind is Derrida, when they asked him a question, what would you want to know most about philosophers? And he says, their sex life. It's like, I always love that answer because, yeah, what was Nietzsche's sex life? I don't think he was the most successful with women, as far as I know. And how does that, not just with women though, but just with relationships in general, how does that translate to his worldview and his philosophizing?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to be dismissive and pejorative about that, right? Like we can treat him as a kind of weirdo, and I think he's much richer emotionally than most people's casual dismissals would suggest. But at the same time, it's clear he didn't really have a lot of deep interpersonal, emotional, or sexual relationships with people, and it's amazing to think of what that character would be if he'd had that other kind of nourishment, but clearly he didn't.
Yeah. I love Nietzsche though, with his work, so I don't want to dunk on him or commit any egregious fallacies there. And who would you say besides kind of integral theory? Because when I think about you, I think about integral theory. I guess, how do you see yourself intellectually in your kind of lineage and influences?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I mean, I think the reason I ended up finding my way to integral theory is because I resonate with a planetary scale post pluralism of some kind. And I think it's perfectly plausible to accept the full range of modern science and deep postmodern criticisms, and have that all fit together in a way that's instinctive and universalizing and spiritually efficacious and harmonious, and that we can all get together on this project. So that's my general orientation, and it speaks, I think, again to my sort of spiritual background, which is a lot of training in Buddhism and meditation and things like that. So I relate to all of this stuff to my own attempt to bring the different parts of myself into a resonant coherence, and then to, let's say, devotionally relate to that excess coherence. But there's certainly figures the people I go back to. That's what's important to me. It's not so much what I read, but what I reread that really seems significant to me, right? I reread Wilber, I reread Nietzsche, I reread Gurdjieff, I reread Socrates, I reread Kurt Vonnegut, right? There's people who there's always something there for me. And when I move up a notch in my own understanding and go back to them, the thing I found is in there. So that's a handful of super complex thinkers that are always a step ahead of me is what I'm looking for.
Yeah. It's like, it really takes a lifetime to get intimate with someone's work, especially when someone who is as prolific as Nietzsche, or Plato, or Socrates via Plato. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's how I sort of relate to the Stoics. I'm so intellectually jazzy. I just love exploring all these different ideas, but that's sort of my home base.
Yeah, I've always appreciated the Stoics, and I got a new appreciation for them through Nassim Taleb's work. But my own stuff, Socrates, Heraclitus, Diogenes were like my main guys in Greece.
My main guys in Greece. So I'm just being mindful of the time. I'm curious if there's any questions alive for you, but I'm also curious, and perhaps this could be like plugging your Stoa session that's coming up in a couple of weeks, like what you have in store. Because I asked you if you're interested to, because I saw you, I saw you on Rebel Wisdom, and I've been obviously aware of your channel. John seems like he's on it every second week, and I really like that kind of history of integral theory that you did with Rebel Wisdom, or didn't talk about the history, but you talked about where the current state of it is. And I'm like, you know what, it'd be really good to get like just like a history, perhaps in like a slide presentation, because I've been aware of integral since, for a while, like 15 years or whatever, but I'm not even aware of the history and how it evolved and stuff. And I imagine you are. So I think that would be quite delicious. So I'm curious if you want to give me and perhaps anyone listening a sneak preview.
No, there's a good chance we'll be recording that before anybody sees this, but nonetheless, I think it's a great question. There's an ambiguity about integral, which is how much are we talking about Ken Wilber's work and how much are we talking about something much bigger? And if we talk about something much bigger, that has two sides, which is who were all the integral thinkers? Where did these ideas come from? Who was doing this already before it was called integral theory? And on the other hand, where is it going now? Because obviously it's not just confined to Ken Wilber's mentality. It's merging with all these adjacent communities. Ken Wilber's going to die. And frankly, for 20 years already, the people in this community have been branching out, doing their own things. They've been in a creative ferment. So there's a prehistory, a history, and a future to it, which is how I wanted to frame it. Although it's still really important to look at the sequence of his thinking and the different phases that it went through and the ideas that he tried to introduce, what the historical and cultural moment was, the things that come out of, say, transpersonal psychology that he was trying to embrace or correct. It's really interesting to look at it in connection with Greg Henrique's work, because Greg's doing a very similar thing to Wilber in a way, because Wilber started out trying to say, what do all the schools of psychology have in common? And then it turns out to define that, I need a cosmological model that defines all of the different human disciplines and puts them on the same page. And that's where Greg is right now. So it seems like Wilber was, to my mind, not the creator of a theory, but an example of how to go about trying to integrate a post-pluralist meta-level model of reality. Right. And I think his genius was to say, these are the things you can't do without. Right. So there's the things he included and the way he put them together. The way he put them together is sort of integral TM. But the things in his grab bag of what you absolutely need if you're going to make a meta model, that is gold. And you can put those together in a number of different ways, and lots of other guys are. And anybody who's working with those elements, that's our community.
I like that. So you see him sort of like a pioneer in the meta modeling space, and then the integral TM is just sort of almost the fossilized version of that. But we're all in his debt in a way, because he was one of the first guys who did it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, right when I got involved in the community, I needed to say to myself, integralist versus integralite, which is to say I was making a distinction between people who know the model and people who are living that reality. People who, if they happen to come in contact with the model, recognize the things that are being discussed, because that's already going on for them. But most of them are out there and they've never come in contact with the model. And that's what it's describing. It's describing people who see those things at that level, who see those vision, logic, interdisciplinary patterns. And this helps make sense of them. And he did a lot of really good work. He's not a god or a guru, and we're not bound to his system or anything like that. But he was a really effective elder on the path of human beings trying to come up with a trans-relativistic model of reality that we could get together on.
Yeah. I'm excited for your session.
Yeah. Well, here's a Wilber kind of thing. Wilber is, he loves Robert Kegan's notion of developmental adult progress, whereby the subject of a stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage, meaning that we, to some degree, grow by becoming clear about what was previously our background. And I'm curious about your sense of background in terms of reality. Like, if you were going to describe reality, what is the cosmos? How old is it? What shape is it? What does reality look like to the instincts of Peter Limberg, knowing that he's not stuck in this reality, but maybe he's moving beyond the description that he's coming up with, as long as he comes up with an authentic description?
So reverse something's coming up with the Keegan thing. Like someone said, Colin Morris actually said, what's the Keegan stage where you stop giving a shit about Keegan stages? It's like whatever that Keegan stage is, that's me right here, right? That's me. And that might kind of like go into your question. It's, like I don't like answering questions like that. I'll be, and the same thing with the first question with the education. It's like yeah, it's like some other people are better equipped at that. And it's like, it's above my pay grade, and I don't feel called to have, so I could, obviously take a thing of it, but it's not something that, especially for our last question, I just really want to dig into. And in that way, I'm not called to abstract in that way. Let's put it that way.
How do you make sure you're not called versus you're unwilling to take the risk?
I don't know.
That's fair. Okay.
You like that pregnant pause too?
Yeah,
I actually really thought about it. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, that's a I don't know.
Number one rule is you shouldn't ask an annoying question if you're not ready to answer yourself.
Fair enough. I think I test myself by pretending I might be adverse to the risk, right? Like I try to, one of the reasons I think that I am where I am intellectually is that I try to answer every question. I might not do a good job, but I'm open to the idea that I potentially have a reasonable answer to anything anybody asks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I take that risk. And very often I'm going to fail and be wrong. But when I go over how I was wrong, I might get somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way I handle it is I just try and then see how it turns out.
Yeah, and so I think I have an answer now for that called versus risk thing. There's a certain quality of being called, and then when being afraid of doing something, there's a certain fear that arises usually, and I'm getting better at catching it. And it's a lot of times it's domain specific, and then it has it's almost like a connoisseur feel or fear that you have to get. And I used to be, terrified, super social anxiety. Then I would do it with like acting classes, public speaking, and just the fear of public speaking that's always present there, right? Just building a relationship with that affords sort of like discernment and felt sense level sensitivity of when you're operating on fear or, not operating on something because of fear. And when I'm being called, it just feels called to do something or called not to do something, and there's no fear present. I just kind of like I can grok it. So it's hard to language for me, but it's more of that kind of that going back to the subtle felt sense realm.
Yeah, I guess I let other people mediate between two sides of this for me. Like on the one side is the growth mindset thing where I understand that things I'm not good at are the things I should be working on in order to acquire both self-esteem and humility simultaneously, right? Which is not what I got in school. I got pats on the head for skills that I already had built in. And so what I want is to grow by doing things I don't feel like I'm good at. That's on one side. The other side is the demon side, which is there are things that I am hopefully progressively better at deciding to do because they are very me. And I don't have to worry about a whole bunch of other stuff in the degree to which I figure out what is very me to do. But between those is other people. And when other people ask me questions, I try to take them seriously and I try to answer their questions, even if I don't necessarily know the answer. And I've found that over time, that's been a tool for building a really transperspectival map of the world in a very individual and idiosyncratic way, which is that I have my answer to most questions that get asked in the meta discourse space because I've just tried, even though a lot of those attempts were failures.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess maybe my Stoic bias here is showing because, like they're almost like they advocate an anti-loquacious, like more parsimonious type of way of speech. Like if you don't have to say anything, don't say anything. And I've been doing that more and more, just kind of staying within my circle of competence and not having to have an opinion on everything. So I almost have the opposite approach. And I'm not saying this approach is better or whatever. It's just sort of that's how it kind of it's shaking out for me in a way. But that being said, I like when someone getting my empathy on or active reflective listening, I do that all day. I can kind of like talk about other people's worldviews or whatever. But yeah, I don't have an opinion on a lot of things actually. I'm just listening to like a Borea, and it feels more authentic just not to say anything, just to say I don't know or don't take a shot at it. A little more of I guess the Stoic approach for
it. It's a very tricky balance. Like I know my girlfriend always helps me around answering questions I don't actually know the answer to, because it's important to A, be able to say you don't know, and B, not to be overly committed to the loquacious verbal dimension of reality. At the same time, I think it's also important to say, I'm going to try, because trying is my leading edge.
That's cool. Yeah. It seems like the on one hand, if you have high verbal intelligence, which you obviously do, they're sort of like, I have a fast car, I just want to drive it fast for its own sake. It's like, but then there's the other like the side, like the charitable side, is that okay, like the only way, like I know what I love writing, right? I just can't stop writing, and I do my best thinking when I'm writing. And if I didn't have that sacred space of writing, then like all these delicious thoughts wouldn't emerge. And I know people who have high verbal intelligence, they need this domain of kind of like speech in order to kind of flesh out their worldview and discover it. And even if their areas are, they're not their expertise at it or whatever, it's like taking a shot at it is that kind of like that college try thing that you just mentioned.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, it's related to the daimon thing in a way, because for me, the excitement of trying to answer a question I don't know is that I reach for a hunch, right? I reach for a half-formed intuitive thing that comes from another part of me, and I don't know why, but I'm going to trust that part, and I'm going to try to language it. So I'm in service to this other part of myself, and I'm its secretary, so to speak. And I'm going to give a first try, and then maybe later I'll do a second or a third try. But to me, when I can get my conscious verbal hands on something that I know is a feeling that I can't justify, that's so beautiful to me that I'm willing to dig around in the mud to try to find it.
You're seducing me away from Stoicism, my friend. I better jump off the Zoom call. Well, it was a pleasure jamming with you and connecting, Layman. Definitely looking forward for your Stoa visit.
Yeah, all right. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Good to talk to you, man. Great to get to know you.
Yeah, likewise. Bye.